our very first guest today. And he's coming directly from Berlin in Germany. And I'm very, very excited for welcoming Jakob Freund to be here with us. Jakob Freund is the co-founder and CEO of Camunda. He's responsible for the company's vision and strategy. He's also the driving force behind Camunda's global growth and takes responsibility for the company culture. As well as holding an MSc in computer science, he co-authored the book Real Life BPMN, and it's a sought-after speaker at technology and industry events. Jakob, what a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time today to share your expertise with a global audience.
Thank you, Josep. Very nice introduction. I appreciate it. So, yeah, I'm one of those guys who wrote a book. I think you mentioned that, but I also have a bit of practice experience, which I wanted to share with the audience today. So, welcome everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm with you today. And what I would like to share is a vision that we like to call automate any process anywhere. So let me just show my screen and take it from here. And then I'm very happy to answer any questions that might come about. So a quick intro in case you don't know Camunda yet. We are a software company that originated out of Berlin, Germany, but is now globally present. And we focus on process automation. And I mentioned that fun story about the book. So when my co-founder and I started Camunda back in 2008, we didn't want to build a software business. We just wanted to help organizations apply business process management, and we're quite passionate about that discipline. So we wrote that book based on the first experiences that we had gathered. We gathered more experiences over the course of 5 years, and then turned our experiences into a software product, basically, which is all about process automation. And it is a bit unusual compared to many other products out there because, for example, it's very developer oriented. So I'm going to explain that a bit more because it is part of that vision I want to share with you today. Long story short, nowadays we are a pretty well-established software vendor when it comes to automation with many different customers all over the world. I would say one of the most exciting projects that we are able to support nowadays is the Mars 2020 mission. So the Perseverance rover that is deployed on Mars right now, sending pictures, etc., back to Earth, is supported by Camunda, not on the rover, but on Earth, but still Camunda helps processing the data that is being sent back. That's a process, and it's automated on Camunda, which is obviously something that we're very proud of and quite excited about. However, typically our customers don't send rovers to Mars. They have other matters to take care of, and that's what I want to talk about. And I'd like to start by quoting an article that I've read a few years ago, actually, but still very valid. It was published by Guardian, and I can really recommend it. It's about the overarching fear of death by Amazon. So what does death by Amazon mean? No matter what industry you're in, if you're an insurance company or a bank or a telco company, whenever you need to serve customers in order to actually generate revenue, you're now under threat to some degree by Amazon or other digital native companies, because and Amazon here, by the way, is really just it's sort of a symbol. So what they have figured out is the secret sauce of providing superior customer experience, like really giving people what they want, when they want, where they want it right away. This experience is now sort of determining people's expectations also towards the bank, the insurance, the telco provider, you name it. So the overarching fear is that Amazon or someone else who might be able to provide similar experiences might enter our industry. So the Amazon of insurance, the Amazon of banks. It doesn't have to be Amazon itself. It can be the next fintech startup, the next insurtech startup, or even that other competitor in our traditional insurance or bank or telco industry that is able to provide the superior customer experience and combining that with operational efficiency at scale, because that is really the sort of impossible balance that that you can actually find if you're an Amazon or a fintech or insurtech startup, and providing that experience with operational efficiency at scale. So once you have achieved that, you can basically put anyone else out of business, which is happening, and therefore the death by Amazon fear that is also very present in many different organizations all over the world as of today. So how do we actually mitigate that? How do we become the Amazon of our industry? That's what everyone is wondering about. And process automation, and the topic for today, is actually a key topic, a key enabler for making that happen. So this is just one data point, an automation survey that was conducted last year, where decision makers in different industries were interviewed about their digital transformation ambition and agenda, and how process automation ties into that. And the vast majority, almost everyone, confirmed that process automation is key to digital transformation. So now the question, of course, is what does that mean? So what is process automation? I mean, there's so many different ways to go about automation out there, and I think Gartner calls it the automation toolbox. So it's not that there's not this one single product, for example, that serves as the silver bullet that makes all of that happening. So one thing to be aware of is that, and that's also confirmed in that study, that actual end-to-end process automation spans across many different possible endpoints, many possible local automations. Think, for example, RPA, which is local task automation, or think AI, which is local decision making, or APIs, which encapsulate local services that, like microservices, etc., that just conduct one part of the overall business process. So end-to-end automation spans across all those different endpoints, and therefore all of those different endpoints need to be orchestrated, and not just in our traditional data center, but also in the cloud. And let it be the public cloud, the private cloud, and increasingly also hybrid setups, because we can't typically just move from our on-prem data center to the public cloud right away. So this is the reality that we're facing as of today. And we're going to talk a bit about those challenges now in this presentation, but it all starts with the realization that process as a concept might be one of the most important concepts that we're seeing in today's organizations. And to maybe also bring that together with a few more fundamental understandings, I wanted to quote a book author that I can highly recommend, Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote a book called Homo Deus. You might have heard of Harari, a historian from Israel, because he also authored the bestseller Sapiens, Brief History of Mankind, so also very recommendable. This one is sort of the sequel, and in Homo Deus, Harari speaks about the 21st century and what we have to expect in that century. And he quotes and states right at the beginning, actually, of that book, that the algorithm might be the single most important concept in our world. So he then goes on describing what algorithms actually are, and he provides a few examples for that. And if you have the time, I recommend to just do that exercise and read the book and read that chapter about the algorithm, and try to express those examples in process flowcharts, because it's actually very straightforward. I did that myself, like modeled those algorithms in the BPMN process modeling standard, and it's very straightforward, very easy to do that. And the reason for that is that the BPMN standard, which is, as you probably know, is the ISO standard, so the globally recognized standard for expressing business processes in flowchart diagrams. That BPMN standard is meant to capture a business process as an algorithm. And as soon as we have that algorithm in our hands, as soon as we have it in front of us and it is clearly described, it also becomes executable, which is the very first ingredient and precondition for successful automation. So when you think of processes in your organization, I recommend to make that connection and understand processes as the algorithms of your organization. So this is really the key fundamental concept to make automation happening across different technologies, products, and deployment setups. Think of a process as an algorithm, capture it as an algorithm, and then you have made the very first step to actually automate it. And it's perfectly possible to do that using well-known, widely recognized standards like BPMN, which are supported by many different vendors and products. Okay, well, that's nice. So we have that, let's say, that fundamental concept. But now, what's the real world situation? What does it mean for us? Well, once we have the process in front of us, express that as algorithms, we can really undergo that fundamental digital transformation that we have to undergo in order to stay on par on eye level with the Amazons of this world, because if we don't do that, we might be out of business tomorrow. So we have to reinvent ourselves or die going forward, which means that we have to organize all those processes across people and systems, and increasingly also physical devices. We have to provide that superior customer experience towards our audiences and markets across different channels, let it be the web, the phone, the on-site experience, you name it. And we have to do all of that in a way that is so efficient and streamlined that we really not just reduce but mitigate those operational costs and improve profitability, especially also at scale. It's always about at scale in order to dominate our industry, our category. So that is easier said than done. I mean, if we are that fintech startup or that insurtech startup, you could argue that, well, they don't, you know, that they lack a lot of things that we have as established enterprises. They don't have our brand, for example. They don't have our market reach. They don't have our customer base. So they lack a lot of things that you could argue are actually at our advantage. At the same time, they're threatening us in our business. And that is because they don't just lack all the good things we have, they also lack something that is actually in our way. And that can be summarized as legacy. To be a bit more specific about that, what sort of legacy am I talking about here? So one is quite obvious. I'm assuming at least you're aware of that. It's about technology. It's about our applications, all those core banking systems, other applications that we maybe purchased like 2 decades ago, or that we implemented ourselves even just 1 decade ago. All of that is an impediment if it actually doesn't help us to quickly, flexibly adjust our operations by reflecting our business processes in the technology that is supposed to execute them. So we have the technology legacy. We have the infrastructure legacy, which then speaks to, for example, the way we operate and provide our technologies. So coming back to the matter about the data center, for example, and the different local data centers that are not so easily transferred to the cloud. And the third element that is often not so, like, not everyone is aware of that. But the third one is our organization's legacy being the organization itself. And this speaks to how we basically go about things. So our, again, processes, our org chart, how we have basically tailored our organization in silos with different departments that are actually departmentalized. So in that sense, they don't really talk to each other, especially if, think, for example, we have the business units on the one hand, and we have the IT and development units on the other hand. And more recent movements in software development, like, for example, Scrum and Agile paradigms, they speak to that problem, but the problem is still there. So when we look at, for example, now the matter of business process and how we understand our processes, we have a huge problem if we don't speak the same language, for example, and are only communicating in change requests and are not really expressive and helpful. So all these roadblocks are in our way, and they aren't in the way of a greenfield startup because they don't have to deal with that sort of legacy. So as an established enterprise, this means that we experience a certain disconnect. So we turn into that disconnected enterprise, which then means that business processes, they are fragmented, they are basically scattered across different departments and IT systems. So we don't have that order to cash, procurement to pay, or similar processes in one hand, and one holistic understanding and one holistic execution level, but we have parts of it in system A, we have parts of this in system B, we hopefully have some sort of integration, but often more than not, and the integration isn't really helpful, and we have no specific responsibility that is all about making sure that this process works actually really, really well from the customer's point of view, as well as from an efficiency point of view. We don't have that in connection with that. We don't have that end-to-end visibility. So this means that we basically don't really know what's happening, and we don't really know where certain cases are pending, or if we're performing well or could perform much better when it comes to, for example, cycle time in order to provide the customer what they have ordered within a certain SLA. So we just don't know, let alone do we have the control, so the ability to do anything about it. So in that sense, we are not able to quickly go through incremental improvement cycles and make change happen within a day or within a week, it always means that we have to set up some more cumbersome IT change project, which then can again take a long time until it is completed, which is completely unacceptable if you really want to again be on par, on eye level with the Amazons of this world. So the silo teams that I mentioned in business and IT hence work in isolation. They're not really a joint collaborative team that work together, but everyone is doing like sort of their own thing, and therefore again more often than not they lose time when it comes to quickly clarifying what needs to be done in the sense of implementing a new process or changing an existing process on the technical level. So the short story is we have that overall disconnection or misalignment across the organization, and that pins us down basically. It means that we are well aware that we need to, for example, launch that new product, launch that new data plan that provides some season-specific offering to our cell phone and mobile network customers, for example, or provide that new way of buying health insurance, or claiming my damage settlements in a very convenient way. All those sort of changes and improvements don't really happen, or don't happen fast enough because of that disconnect. So in total, you could say we are basically paralyzed by that legacy, and quite often it's not this one thing that pins us down. So it's not that we could say, oh, if we could just get rid of that one system, or if we could just replace that one team with a more agile team, for example, and all the issues would go away. As an organization that has grown over years and decades, and sometimes even centuries, with thousands of employees, we typically are pinned down by a number of different and single items that hinder our agility, and in total basically paralyze us. So the big question now is, okay, well, if that is the situation, if that's what's keeping us from combining our existing strengths around brand, market access, market know-how in product delivery, so combining that with all the new and upcoming ways to reach customers, make them aware of us, and provide that amazing experience delivering our services instantly and not overnight, or even over the course of days or weeks. If we want to combine those two things in order to be truly leading our category, but we are hindered by that paralysis, by that legacy, what can we do about it? That's the question that I'm hearing in my conversations with CIOs, Center of Excellence leads for automation, CEOs even sometimes. When I'm hearing that question, the answer is almost always the same. We don't have the luxury of greenfield products or projects. So we need to work with the situation that we have, and we need to transform gradually, step by step. So it means that, okay, let's go from our old legacy world, our old legacy environment, step by step, slowly but steadily, with a relentless focus and strategic agenda, not incrementally. Let's transform ourselves into this new digital me as an organization in order to actually become the Amazon of our industry. That is easier said than done, as you can imagine. But I would argue that, for example, the rise of robotic process automation that you're probably aware of, and we are not an RPA vendor ourselves, so in that sense, we are agnostic. But the rise of RPA is exactly because of that, because existing organizations or established organizations can't just rip out their old legacy systems and replace them with something greenfield, microservices-based modern architecture. They have to somehow automate where they can automate by, for example, mimicking manual behavior that happens in front of a user interface, which is exactly what an RPA robot does. That is not process automation, that is task automation. So in that sense, the acronym RPA is a bit misleading, but it is automation nevertheless, and it's one of those tiny steps that you can make in order to gradually transform and increase the level of automation. in this particular example with RPA, it comes with strings attached that I also want to talk about briefly, just in order to make this presentation also informative. But let's first of all look at the overall situation. So when I say we have that legacy that we need to deal with in order to gradually transform, what does it mean, and what are the typical categories now on a technical level that we have to be aware of? So one is the diversity of endpoints, basically. So when we look at let's say, I don't know, a loan origination process, if I'm a bank, for example, I typically have many different parts of that process. So some things might need to happen manually. So depending on the size of the loan, for example, or the demographics of the customer that applies for the loan, or based on other criteria, we might need some sort of manual check before we actually grant a loan. So we have people basically that contribute to the execution of a process by completing tasks that were assigned to them. That's the manual part. Then we have rules, like business rules, for example, expressed in, for example, decision tables that allow us to automatically make decisions. Not yet AI-based, but let's say simple algorithmic decision table-based decisions, which are also, for example, in my loan origination, might decide upon the creditworthiness of someone who applies for a loan. We have API endpoints, so things that are encapsulated but exposed via a proper, for example, REST API. This could be either some ERP system or core banking system that exposes certain functionality via API, or it could be that we have bought off the shelf, or it could be some homegrown piece of code, basically, that we expose via services, API services, in order to reuse that in different circumstances, including a business process where we might, for example, say, okay, we need to add certain data of the applicant to our core banking system in order to store that data, for example. We might have IoT devices, so actual physical parts that play a role in our business process. I have to admit that my imagination isn't big enough to make something up for the loan origination process in this context, but for example, we're seeing that quite often in research labs. So actual, for example, physical robots conducting certain test operations. That is a typical example of an IoT device that might play a role and contribute to a mission-critical core end-to-end process. We might have microservices exposed, for example, via event bus systems like Apache Kafka, and we have RPA robots. As I said, robots or bots in RPA don't automate processes, they automate tasks. So routines that are relatively short running, typically a set of steps conducted by a human operator. So in that sense, very much an equivalent to the manual work here on the left-hand side, but mimicked and basically by a piece of software called the RPA tool, which again contributes to the end-to-end process. And we have the sort of next generation for the business rule automation. We have the machine learning / AI elements that might, for example, support us in fraud detection, again, when it comes to loan origination, or also our damage claim settlement process. So we need to be able to involve all those different endpoints in our end-to-end process, and those endpoints are often part of our legacy. That's the whole point. So quite often this means that we still need to be able to include our existing systems in the end-to-end automation, and we need a way to make that happen. We also need a way to include, let's say, greenfield developed parts of our business process in those end-to-end flows. And those might be implemented in very different technology stacks. So as the former CEO of Goldman Sachs once said, Goldman Sachs is a technology company. Goldman Sachs is not a bank. Goldman Sachs is a technology company that knows about money. So Goldman Sachs employ more software developers than, for example, LinkedIn or Facebook. So think about that, process that. We're all turning into software companies, and we're all going to employ software developers, coders, Java, C#, Python, you name it, in order to implement our core, like our mission critical, unique, differentiating operations in our systems. It's not going to happen via off-the-shelf products. Use off-the-shelf software for, I don't know, your absence workflow or whatever. But if you're a bank or an insurance and you want to automate your core business, you're always going to conduct actual software development projects, which means that you're going to employ software developers of certain different kinds. And you need, again, the ability to include that diversity of tech stacks in your end-to-end flow. So you might have parts of your process that are implemented in Java and others might be implemented in C#. This is not going to become less, it's going to become more, and because the world becomes more polyglot. And we have to move very, very fast, and we cannot afford to always completely re-platform everything that we have implemented 2 decades ago in, I don't know, Java, to something that we feel might be more modern nowadays, for example. So the third element of complexity is, where do we run our automation stack, basically? So I mentioned the local data center versus the public cloud, the multi-cloud vendor strategies that are coming about. So running parts of it, for example, on GCP, parts of it on Azure or on AWS, and having hybrid cloud setups where you go for parts of it in my public cloud, let it be, for example, GCP, Google Cloud, parts of it in my private cloud, parts of it in my true like on-prem server that is somewhere, I don't know, in my living room. So we have processes. We're seeing end-to-end processes that actually run in those different clouds and local deployments, but it's still the same process. So again, there needs to be seamless handover in order to make that happen in a reliable and customer-friendly way. So all of that requires a new approach to process automation, which is where we come in based on our experience, and that's how we define Camunda as consultants. But of course, this is more philosophy than a certain product. So I just recommend to look for that sort of philosophy when looking at end-to-end process automation and technology stacks, not as a substitute to other elements of your automation toolbox, like, for example, RPA, but as a complement, because you combine those products in order to make true automation happening. So what I would advise against is looking at the old ways of BPMS. So there was a category defined in the early 2000s, basically, called BPM system or BPM suite. That's like 2 decades ago. So back in the days, there was an idea about, hey, I have this one system, this one product, and here I built my entire process automation solution, like a one-stop shop, basically. My UI and my different services and everything that is part of my process is implemented and operated and maintained in this one vendor's product, basically. And often in a way that is sort of, model-driven, low-codish, in the sense of, hey, use our great product, vendor XYZ, implement everything in our XYZ language, and you won't need software developers anymore. That was the promise that was never actually held for mission-critical key business process automation projects. So instead of looking at that isolated one-stop shop in this vendor-specific proprietary way, we recommend to think about process automation as an end-to-end orchestration layer that spans across all those other elements in your process. And that means that those other elements aren't implemented in your end-to-end orchestration layer. It's a natural thing. You need to plug and play basically all the time in order to keep agile and modernize your automation stack. So think about it in a loosely coupled way and not in a vendor-specific proprietary implementation way. So embrace your software developers, your Java, C#, Python developers. They're your strongest asset. You are a software company. No matter what industry you're in, you're a software company. So make sure that you have the best software developers in your organization and empower them with an approach that is developer friendly, not tough to install, extend, closed suite, black box sort of proprietary monolith, but it's developer oriented. It's very open and it allows your different stakeholders to collaborate based on standards. Like, for example, the BPMN standard for process modeling, the DMN standard for decision automation. They are different standards that are embraced by different stakeholders, software developers, enterprise architects, project managers, all the way to business line managers, all the way to the people that make sure your transformation happens smoothly, all the way to even the CIO and even CEOs are able to look at those standards-based diagrams and understand what is happening in their business in a real-time way. So this is what is recommendable in the sense of an approach and a philosophy. If you apply this and you go for that gradual transformation, like project by project, step by step, the business outcomes that you always should be looking for are the 4 on the right-hand side. So those projects should typically provide a better customer experience, either for your end customers, the ones that you're selling to, or your internal customers, if you're looking at internal services, for example, like ITSM. So better customer experience, often measured in metrics like cycle time. That's the usual suspect. I want my stuff faster. Like, that's very simple. I'm traveling to the US from Europe. I want to use my credit card over there. I want to activate my credit card for abroad payments. And I don't want to wait for a day until I get that confirmation. I want to get it now. So don't tell me that you have to process my request in a batch fashion overnight in your mainframe system, because that's how it was implemented. Figure out single instance processing. Provide that customer experience and that service I'm requesting right away. That's the first one. Second one, and it's often a combination, by the way, of those business outcomes. Second one is being able to quicker get to the market, for example, with your new product. I mentioned the data plan example. So being able to come up with a new data plan as a telco company, launch that data plan, I don't know, our special Christmas package for you and your beloved ones, and this is the bundle price. New data plan needs a delivery across different, again, legacy systems. We need to orchestrate all of them in one end-to-end flow, and we need to do that very, very quickly in order to be able to launch our competitive offering before the others do on short notice. That's shorter time to value. Higher agility is obviously related to that. So this is about being able to quickly implement changes. So business driven changes that need to happen in our end-to-end process in order to, again, provide a certain customer experience, or to reflect, for example, compliance and regulations that have changed, etc. So being quick, being fast, despite all those legacy systems that still exist in your organization. And the fourth one, which is again sort of self-explanatory, the operational efficiency that allows you to provide all of that in a very economical way at scale. So those 4 should typically be on your radar when striving for tangible, provable business outcomes of your automation projects. And this is also what you can expect typically. Sometimes just one of the 4, but often it's a combination, in fact. So one example here is Deutsche Telekom. That's the case study I'd like to conclude with. Great role model, I believe. So Deutsche Telekom, biggest telco carrier in Europe, and they have a customer service department, or actually it's its own unit. I think around 3,000 employees looking after customers that have issues with their landlines, for example. They introduced RPA for local task automation a few years ago already. Great success. They're now going through the next cycle of their transformation agenda, basically. So they're now, in this case, using Camunda in order to orchestrate their local RPA bots, so that they don't get overwhelmed by those hundreds of bots, or actually 3,000 bots they now have in production, which is very easy to manage, or very difficult to manage if you're really looking at the end-to-end business process. So they are putting Camunda as an end-to-end orchestrator on top of the RPA landscape, orchestrating those different RPA bots, so telling each bot when it's their turn to complete a certain task as part of the end-to-end process. And now comes the clue. They know, as you hopefully do as well, that RPA is not a long-term solution. RPA lives off the pain of having a legacy system. So RPA is like a painkiller, like an ibuprofen. You know, if you're having back pains, just like pop a pill and you're feeling better. But your back pains are not actually cured. You're just mitigating the symptom. That's RPA. If you really want to become healthy again, and you really want to become a sustainable, modern, technology-based organization, you need to get rid of your legacy eventually. Not in a big bang fashion, but step by step, slowly and relentlessly and steadily. So what they're doing in Deutsche Telekom is they're leveraging the end-to-end orchestration layer, Camunda, and they're now sunsetting selected bots, like one after the other, and replacing those with properly developed microservices. So in that sense, I might have a business process consisting of, let's say, I don't know, 40 steps, and let's say 30 of those are conducted by RPA bots, let's say 5 of them are still conducted by manual work, like a person in front of a computer, and 5 of them are already conducted by microservices, which used to be RPA bots before, which used to be manual work tasks even before that. So going from manual work to RPA bot to microservice, and having that in a hybrid setup within the same business process gives you that flexibility and control to gradually replace first the manual work with bots, then the bots with microservices, or you just skip the bots and go for microservices right away. That depends on your circumstances, obviously. So that is one example to overcome the problem of legacy paralysis in the course of digital transformation. All right, there's plenty of more examples. I mentioned banks, insurance, telcos most often because that's what we typically see as in our customer base. But as you know, I assume process automation is a very industry agnostic topic, all the way to processing data sent back from the Mars rover. So that's obviously like one of a kind as a case study. All right, that's what I had as a presentation. I've shared that with you. Our mission is to automate any process, no matter what endpoints you want to orchestrate, and to automate that anywhere, no matter where you run your business process on Earth or somewhere else. So that's the story of Camunda, and I hope I was able to convey the underlying philosophy, which I believe makes a lot of sense, also outside of specific vendors. Good, I'm done. I don't know if anyone's still here.
Jacob, terrific presentation. I'm gonna ask you to stop sharing your slides so that I can come back in. And so we have a number of questions that have come up here during your presentation. Thank you, audience, for providing those questions. You still have time. If you didn't get your question in, get it in, and I'll now relay them to Jakob here. As we have an opportunity to have this live Q&A. Ask questions that are most meaningful to your context. It doesn't matter if you're experienced or if you're beginning your journey on business process management. So Jakob, I'm going to start with a couple of kind of fundamental questions that were asked by the audience. There's a really good one here by Neil Newby, who is asking, and he asks about the current state of BPM. So I'll read his background. First of all, he says, great presentation. And I grew up in the world of BPM 4 or 5 years ago. When was the shift made to iBPM or intelligent BPM? And so what has been kind of the if you look at the last 5 years or so, what has been kind of the evolution of business process management and this idea of having intelligent business process management? Is that just like fancy branding, or is it because we have technology automation and growth of digital transformation? How do you assess the evolution of BPM in the last 5 years and this intelligent component?
No, that's a great question. And I mean, I've been in this space, in this BPM space for now, gosh, I think like 15 years. So I started to become aware of BPM as a thing when I was still studying, actually. So that was like in 2005. So since then, this whole thing has developed or changed quite tremendously, and I believe sometimes it was also a bit difficult and confusing because BPM is such a broad term. I mean, everything's a process in a way. The management is everywhere, and I mean business. Okay, that's not really qualifying it any further. So so business process management is it's an incredibly generic term, and therefore that's curse and blessing. And the I didn't make that any easier. I mean, intelligent, again, it's not very specific. So that's a preface. I'm saying that because it means that different people might have very different opinions about the semantics behind the term. When I think about the past 5 years, let's have a kind of conversation about that. I think BPM as a term is not actually a buzzword anymore, in fact. That's a pity because it speaks about something very, very important. So the problem of process and process management and process automation has not gone anywhere. It's very imminent, and it becomes bigger and bigger. And the rise of RPA, for example, is a great testament to that. So in that sense, from a marketer standpoint, BPM is actually a bit problematic nowadays. It's not as hot anymore. From my practitioner standpoint, it's actually very hot, and there's a lot to do in the space out there. So trying now to answer that question, I think that therefore BPM practitioners and protagonists have struggled with the term a bit in the past 5 years. But with regards to actual projects that happening, what I can talk about, I mean, we grew like 60, 80, 90% year over year in the past 5 years. So like we're doing well, and we're doing only BPM. So in that sense, there's a certain let's say gap between the word and the marketing and the reality out there. On the other hand, now quickly covering the intelligent aspect. So Gartner says, for example, that in hyperautomation, which is not a category but an idea, a concept, you have an automation toolbox. There you have, for example, RPA, but also there are IBPMS and also dedicated AI and machine learning components, and they also sort of throw in process mining, and then you have a certain mix. I would argue that it depends very much how you define intelligence in the BPM context. But if you think of specifically now machine learning and AI, there is potential and opportunity there, and it is being leveraged. For example, I mentioned the fraud detection example, which is then part of an overarching process. But for example, also learning continuously by data generated by automated processes, and then feeding that back into a process to predict, for example, a certain risk in a certain process instance, like, oh, under those circumstances, this might be a fraud attempt. And then we didn't detect it yet, but we are aware of it and can route the process accordingly, for example, to a manual worker. Stuff like that is happening. But quite frankly, that's maybe like 5 or 10% of the projects. Like the big problems, they are much more down to earth, like just solving the disconnect problem, for example, about the legacy systems. It's very, if you think it as a practitioner, it's quite boring sometimes, not so fancy, but there's a lot of money to make by helping organizations overcome that problem.
Very well, very well. Great insights, Jakob. I have the next question here comes from William Fuller, and he is talking about the mention you had about standards-based collaboration. And his question is, are there universal standards like ISO standards related to this area, to this collaboration area that you described during your presentation?
Absolutely, yeah. I mentioned one, but I should like explain that maybe a bit further, or make sure it's like received. So the most important standard out there is called BPMN, so Business Process Model and Notation. If you Google that standard, you should hopefully see that it's an ISO standard. So it was originally invented actually by a gentleman called Stephen White, great guy by the way, worked at IBM back in the days in 2002, was then embraced by Object Management Group. So that's then like an industry standard group. They really did the heavy lifting with the further development. It was published in 2011 in version 2.0, which was a big milestone, because in that standard you can graphically express a business process, flowchart, boxes, arrows, nice little symbols, but you also like automatically describing it as executable code. So the standard defines a so-called serialization format underneath that flowchart. And tools like Signavio and Camunda and 50 other tools speak that standard. So if you want to learn the most important standard in process automation, look up BPMN. That's what I would recommend.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. The next question is from Jorge Hincapie here, and Jorge is talking about the issue about, you know, to empower this transformation. But before I get to this question, you know, just as a setting, I have been for over 25 years on BPM, and if you look at BPM in manufacturing, for example, it's such a straightforward thing, because engineers and scientists are sitting there thinking about how to design a manufacturing line. End-to-end process definition is something that's very basic in the steps of manufacturing processes. Then you go into the world of transactional processes, and it's kind of a free-for-all, that everybody has kind of their own idea on how it should be done. You know, this leadership team is in charge for 3 years, so they do things in a certain way. There comes a new leadership team, and they change the philosophy almost overnight about how certain processes are going to be done. And then over time, especially in transactional processes, there is the lack of process definition end-to-end is striking, number one, and then there is this organizational silos that form. So all of this to address, to bring up Jorge's question, which is that before we even get into automation, what are you must experience this all the time, because you're gonna go try to automate something for your client and you get into some basic fundamental issues of organizational silos, lack of end-to-end process definition and understanding. So the question is, how do you address some of those fundamental issues before you move into automating processes?
Yeah, that's an old question. That's a very good question. So the problem is obviously not new. And what you said, of course, Giuseppe, is right. Still, there's so many angles to that. Like, you know, top management commitment. How do I get the buy-in? Get people's time to sit down with me and discuss their process. And they're reluctant. They have their daily work they need to look at. So I gotta say, as also a, let's say, a seasoned practitioner with scars on my back, I still, you need to dangle a carrot in front of stakeholders that is strong. And the one carrot that, because of our business, I guess, we're most familiar with is in fact the automation part. So what I mean is, and that's again, think waterfall against agile. Like waterfall means I have like 6 months of concept and then 6 months of implementation. Agile means I have, let's say, I don't know, 2 to 4 weeks of concept at most, and then I have my increment implementation. I get something back, I see something, it's tangible, and then I move on. So what worked for us really well was to really combine that. So don't think again in silos like process mapping and process automation, but think it as one integrated exercise. So let's look at a process, let's capture it quickly, let's feed it into an engine, see how it runs in a simulated fashion first, but go through that cycle as quickly as possible. That is just because automation opens all doors. So it's a strong ally if you're in the process management practice.
That's an excellent point, and I think you mentioned this during your presentation. If there's the good, the bad, and the ugly related to RPA, for example, but the good of RPA is that it has created, because of certain task automations, it kind of has surfaced the value creation potential of certain areas that allow people to look at those areas and say, oh, you know what, there's more to be done here end to end, and it built maybe a bit of momentum to do that end-to-end process exploration. Because as you mentioned earlier, sometimes the end-to-end process definition can feel to organizations like trying to solve world hunger, especially in very complex processes, you know, end-to-end. So this point opportunities for value creation of RPA is a great way of kind of getting people interested, and then they say there's more that we can do, and it's almost building that from the inside out. There are pros and cons of all approaches, but I think you would agree that so much of that depends on the level of commitment from senior leaders and the vision and understanding that they have of the entire program. So great questions from the audience. Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask you a 10-second question because we're over time, but this is a quick question from Anna Martinez here. We talk about all these technologies and we cannot overlook the fact that there is process mining out there. We talk about RPA. How does process mining, if you could do it quickly for me, fit into this picture?
Okay. Quickly. So if I don't have process automation yet, but I have processes and they leave traces in my data, I can use process mining to get a first understanding of how those processes actually run. And the only intersection with automation is that I might also get an idea or direction of where I could apply automation in order to leverage potential. That's how these work together, basically.
That's fantastic. And for the audience and for those of you who don't know what process mining is, that was just a great primer right there for Jakob. And next week, we have an entire 3 days dedicated exclusively to process mining. Make sure you register for that conference. Jakob Freund, thank you so much for taking your time to share your expertise for a global audience. From Berlin, Germany to the world, we're very thankful for your participation.
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. Great having you. Oh, being part of your presentation.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Jakob Freund, the CEO of Camunda, sharing his expertise about business process management. We will be shifting gears in our next session that's going to start at the top of the hour. and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Keith Cleanscale, who is going to talk to us about applications in government. And specifically, his session is Your Attitude is Your Breakthrough. Change the attitude, change the culture. So Dr. Keith Cleanscale is going to talk to us about how he has engaged his organization and government in a journey of culture, business, and digital transformation, and how attitude matters. So I hope to see you back at the top of the hour for this exciting session. So thank you.